All right. Thank you for coming. Having occasionally mentioned to some of you aspects of my early life in Poland, Germany, and Canada, Pauline asked me if I would be willing to share a little at half-hour session in early September. I agreed, hoping to inspire some others to do the same in the next few weeks or months. I have labeled this short talk as God's grace and protection in my life. I was born in Poland into a German-speaking community of Mennonite families. These families resided in Wymyśle, Poland, near Plock, which you can see on the screen, for some 150 years in a small village some 70 miles west of Warsaw. Originally, the Mennonites were established in Holland and Western Germany in the mid-1500s, sometime after the Reformation. The Mennonites fled to Prussia and Poland as a result of persecution by Lutherans, Catholics, and Calvinists, Presbyterians, for their Anabaptist and non-resistant stances. Anabaptist means rebaptizing. In other words, they were sheep stealing, in effect, taking people who had been baptized as a child and rebaptized. And then, of course, non-resistant stance meant not joining armies. My father decided to become a teacher, being encouraged by several teachers in his village. He was very quick at learning languages and was fluent in German and Polish. He picked up several other languages during his teacher training. After his schooling and teacher internship, teaching jobs were not available in Poland due to an economic recession in 1934. Through a friend who had moved to Paraguay, he received an invitation for a job there. In the spring of 1935, he proposed to my mom. They were planning to be married in June and then start the process of getting a visa for the Paraguayan embassy. Dad had applied for teaching positions in several districts soon after his graduation, which was in 1934, and unfortunately, in August 1935, he received a call to come to Plock, the city on the screen, immediately to sign a contract for 1 year at a small town, Pocino, near Plock. They were overjoyed. There was no more talk of going to Paraguay. 8 of my direct family made a tour of Poland in May 1919, and we visited Wymyśle. And this is the church where my mom and dad were married. Really dilapidated by that time. They had used it as a warehouse and other things, but we saw it when we went to Poland on our tour. His first teaching job was in a one-room school of some 90 students in grades 1 to 4, each grade taking 2 years. So they were up to grade 8 by our system, 2 grades being taught in the morning and the other 2 in the afternoon. The living quarters were located on the 2nd floor of the schoolhouse. I was born, aided by a midwife, in early April 1936, as the firstborn in Dad's first year of teaching. After 2 years of teaching there, he was relocated to a smaller school, Borki, where my brother Frank was born. In our tour, we were able to go to Borki actually Pochettino, my birthplace, was gone. It had been amalgamated into the city of Plock. But here are 7 of the 8 tour members: Tim, who's helping me, Alfreda, Julie, my brother Leonard, myself, my sister Trudy, and Linda, our daughter, from Montreal. And that is the schoolhouse, which now had been converted into residence. And there you can see me standing beside the old oven that was used for heating the whole building way back when we occupied it. Then in September 1939, Hitler attacked Poland, and many German-speaking communities were initially subjected to persecution by Polish militias until the German forces had taken over control of Poland. Within a few months after the start of the war, many men and women who spoke German and Polish were required to be employed to help the German authorities to provide translation services. That employment was not voluntary, it was required. The military authorities had organized the civic administration of the town where we lived, and Dad was employed as a town secretary to assist the German mayor of that town. They quickly were able to call back most of the Polish officials of the town hall to get the government working again. In April 1941, my sister Trudy, who I showed you on the picture, followed in October 42. A brother Heinz joined the family. My sister Trudy, this is in Gombin. This I love Gombin, is the town where we saw that. The war in the Eastern Front in Russia was going badly for Germany, and many men with exempt status, such as teachers, were called up. In late October 1942, Dad was called up for training in Germany 3 weeks after the birth of my brother Heinz. This training took nearly a full year in various locations, including Latvia. In October 1943, Dad was ordered to the front west of Kyiv, Ukraine. Because he knew how to handle horses, he was offered the job of a quartermaster with horse-drawn supply wagon. This meant that he spent much of his time a distance away from the front, preparing the rations of food and cigarettes for each soldier handed out at supper time. In the next 3 months, they were involved in fierce battles, which resulted in heavy losses and major retreats. He then was granted a leave of absence of 2 weeks. When he returned to Warsaw after his leave of absence, he was informed that the infantry division had been completely destroyed in combat. Dad considered that having been absent from the front during the 2 weeks was a gift of God's grace. Kyiv is over there, and they were in this area here. And the Russians had already taken over Kyiv, and the Germans wanted to push back to recapture Kyiv. Now he was assigned to another unit, also as quartermaster, in Slovakia, southwest of the Ukraine. One evening before he could return, he was pinned down by sniper fire, and as a result of heavy frost and inadequate footwear, he had frostbitten toes on both feet and was taken to a first aid station, and then they were ordered to evacuate, resulting in being taken by ambulance further west. After a thorough examination, the frostbitten toes were treated, and they found several other health issues of my dad. The doctors had an ulterior motive to keep him as a helper because he knew how to handle horses, and because he spoke Polish and Slovak. Frequently he was sent to buy medical supplies from Slovak drugstores and medical establishments, and the population at inflated prices, of course. Now I'll go back to our situation in Poland. Back in Poland, on January 6, 1945, so that's about 4 months before the end of the war, women and small children whose husbands served in the German army, of German-speaking, of course, received notice from the NSV, the welfare agency in Germany, to pack and get ready for evacuation to the western part of Poland and eastern part of Germany. We were brought to the railroad station where we boarded a train, which brought us to a station close to the frontier for a temporary residence of 10 days. After that, we returned to the railway station where we children were freezing in the bitter cold, so Mom put us in the waiting room. Mom loaded the luggage into the train, but left one large wicker basket with clothes and blankets back, for she could not lift it herself. Then she ran to get the children. When she came back to the train track, the train had left with her luggage, and she stood there with a large basket and 4 children. This resulted in the loss of many personal items and pictures. We now went back to the waiting room and waited until the morning. Then we could board a freight train to get to Frankfurt and on towards Berlin. A railroad man helped Mom put the basket onto the train. We went south of Berlin to Jüterbog, where we then taken by a horse carriage to Bardenitz. That was the town where we lived. And we got a room from a renter. In Jüterbog, Mom had reported the loss of her savings book from the credit union in Poland, which was in her lost luggage. She received a ration coupon and some money in Jüterbog. After a few weeks, the mailman brought her a large amount of money from her savings account, which had been located. As long as the German authorities were in charge, we were taken care of fairly well. Then, on May 8, 1945, the German command and allies agreed on a surrender to end the war. Dad was placed in a PW camp in Yugoslavia run by the Russians. Orders then came to screen all the German prisoners of war, to dismiss those who could not work. The healthy were sent to Russia to clean up the war damage and to work in the coal mines. Since Dad spoke German and some Russian, he became an interpreter for the Russian camp doctors along with 2 others. During this process, the German prisoners were ordered to surrender their German money. After the camp was emptied of all the prisoners, the 3 interpreters were given documents to allow them to return to Germany. The camp commander told them to take some of the German money. "You will need it." So they did. One of the 3 knew where he needed to go and left by himself, but Dad and the other needed to go to East Germany to start searching for their families. They bought train tickets to get to the nearest city, Dessen, on the Elbe River. The camp was here, and Dessen, this is the Elbe River and the German border. So they had to get train tickets to get there. After they had left the train in Dessen, they were approached by a German-speaking woman warning them that gangsters looked for obvious German men in civilian clothes, led them to the Elbe River, shot them, and threw them into the water to go home to their fatherland. She asked for some money, hid them in the janitor's room, and arranged for them to surreptitiously, at 2 a.m., slip under the 2 parked trains and go to the end of the 3rd train, climb into the brakeman's booth, sit down on the floor. The door would be locked from the outside. Soon the train started to move, crossed the Elbe River, and then it stopped. Someone unlocked the door, and they were free in Germany. Praise the Lord. Now Dad started to search for a place to stay and to work to feed himself. He found a farmer, Mr. Jurgens, in the town of Altmetel, who needed workers to harvest potatoes. This farmer was owned by also owned a local bakery. One evening, before the evening meal was served, near the bakery, Dad heard a commotion in the bakery between 2 Russian soldiers and the wife of the owner. He went to speak to them in Russian and found out they wanted to have a cake baked. And much to the delight of the soldiers and the baker's wife, they were able to bring her the needed supplies, and she baked the cake. When the owner heard the story, he had Dad come and have dinner with him and hired him as a handyman in the bakery to help communicate with the Russians whenever the need arose. Dad also started searching on various local refugee places on posted bulletin boards. Of course, there was no internet and no way of getting information about people, so people posted bulletin boards about themselves and looking for others. And he finally found his sister and her young son, and also living in East Germany, and had them move to Altmetel, employed in the bakery. As soon as mail to Canada had been established, my mom and her brother Erhard, living in West Germany, had both remembered their sister's address in Olds, Alberta, Canada, and they wrote to her, both of them. Somehow Dad got Erhard's address in West Germany, and thereby Dad found us in April 1946, in less than a year. Mom and Dad corresponded, but he did not tell us when he would come. He got out all the train tickets and came. Here's what Dad wrote about his entering our village. On the village street, a boy came walking, chewing a piece of bread. Could that be my oldest son, Richard? He had grown so tall. He came closer, stopped, looked at me. Papa, he exclaimed, and tears rolled down his cheeks. I hugged him, and he said, I have to go to school. I replied, not anymore. I have come to take you with me. But this is the last day of school, and I have to get my report card. I said, just show me where Mama and the other children are, then you can go. So he did. The joy was overwhelming. There was a telling, asking questions, and also some planning for the future, end of quote. So the trip from Bardenitz to Altmetel we were south of Berlin, and the train trip takes us to Altmetel and up closer to the North Sea. After a year later, Mom and Dad decided to sneak across the border to the British zone to visit Erhard's family and his mom's mother, or my mom's mother. On the return to Altmetel, they were stopped by a Russian border patrol, but managed to slip away in an unguarded moment. They were determined to go back with our whole family, for in West Germany there was a total different atmosphere than in East Germany. They came back on a Friday and found out that the police had been there looking for Dad. Someone had reported them for having gone illegally to the West. Dad contacted a friend in the neighboring village and asked him to drive us the following morning to a town near the border. There lived a brother of our storekeeper, Mr. Schroeder, on a farm right next to the border. The friend agreed to drive us in his half-ton truck, and we started packing. All this had to go on in deepest secrecy. Mr. Jurgens, of course, knew of this, but we could rely on him. Before dawn, the friend's truck pulled up at our home. We children were quickly loaded in the rear of the truck, as well as our suitcases, and away we went. We arrived in the town near the border and were dropped off at an inn. Then Dad went towards Schroeder's farm. He was willing to help. Dad left him some coffee and tea, which we had received in care packages from Canada. This worked miracles. Mr. Schroeder spoke to the German border guards and bribed them. Then he put us up in an empty house next to the bridge across a canal which was the border between west and east. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, he came by himself to help us carry the suitcases to the bridge. Now we started a shuttle service across the bridge, bringing Mum and the 3 small children over to the other side. Then Dad and I took our luggage to the other side of the bridge. This was a farewell which did not hurt at all. On the other side, we were stopped by West German border guard. They let us pass, but warned us to be on the lookout for British border patrols. They would send us back to the east if they got hold of us. We now slowly shuttled toward the highway leading into Lübeck, about 100 kilometers from the border, about 60 miles. Dad then stood by the highway waving a package of coffee and soon had a trucker stop asking where we wanted to go. Dad replied, "To the railroad station in Lübeck." We were again loaded into the empty truck, and a little more than an hour later, Dad was buying rail tickets to Gronau, where the Mennonites had set up a refugee camp in a large auditorium for Mennonites from the east. Here the 6 of us were housed in a space about 10 foot by 10 foot with 3 double-decker bunk beds, the walls and doors being military blankets. You can see these. It's about 10 feet by 10 feet, 3 bunk beds, double-decker, and we could actually stand on top, we children, and look all over the place and look into the people's dwellings. And there must have been something like 8 of these in a row, and there were 4 rows. There were 2 hallways and 4 rows of these double-decker bunk beds, and that was our living quarters for 9 months. Then, after 9 months, we lived in Gronau from June 1947 to April 1948, about 9 months. We received notifications to start being processed for our visa to enter Canada. Dad's brother and Richard, living in Acme, and 2 of Mum's brothers-in-law had decided to sponsor our immigration to Canada. There were some problems. Dad was a school teacher, and someone asked, "What will he do here? Will he have to feed him and his entire family?" But his brother Richard got him a place with a farmer as a farm laborer. To start the process of being examined, we had to move by train to Fallingbostel, the immigration transit camp near Hanover. Here we were put into a large former army barracks building, and the medical proceedings began. To us, the long waiting periods between examinations were a torture. We had to have a series of inoculations, all kinds of tests and x-rays taken. Finally, around July 15th, 1948, we were called before the Canadian consul and were admitted to Canada. We were impressed. We were issued immigration identity cards for the Dutch ship MS Tabinta, a small to medium-sized passenger ship. Our train trip from Fallingbostel to Rotterdam. We left Rotterdam on July 17th and boarded the ship on July 19th, 1948. Details about our trip leaving Hanover. After some stops to change locomotives in Germany, in West Germany, it was getting dark. Near the Dutch border, our identity cards were inspected, and then on entering Holland, now our eyes, used to the darkened cities in Germany, saw a gorgeous display. Railroad stations, as well as streets of towns, were flooded with lights. Especially lovely were the colored lights of the neon signs. The sea voyage took about 10 days. The first day slowly with heavy ship traffic in the Canal La Manche from Rotterdam to the English Channel. But then, when we proceeded into the English Channel, we saw a bit of England. The ship speed improved. We now encountered heavy swells and making the ship rock sideways and up and down, causing some of us to suffer seasickness. Not many attempted to eat much at supper time. Some time after setting sail, my dad wrote in his memoir these significant words: "My dear Lydia," that was Mum's name, "stood beside me. We looked into each other's eyes and knew now that we were looking with courage into the future. Now that by all human judgment we were in safety, we shuddered when we thought of the dangers in which we had been. Yes, a feeling of gratitude to our Redeemer was predominant in the moment of departure from Europe." After a stormy day and night, the sea calmed down and we had gorgeous sun-filled days. During the next week, the weather was mostly good, with an occasional stormy half-day. Occasionally, we were awakened by the sound of foghorns as the ship glided through the calm waters. On the 8th day, we started to look for land. In the mid-afternoon, a speck of white appeared to the left in the distance, and it turned out to be an iceberg. Soon after that, we could see land, and it was the Isle of Belle Isle. We had entered the Strait of Belle Isle. We disembarked in Quebec City, Canada, on July 29th, 1948, a 10-day voyage. We were received by the immigration authorities, the papers were examined, and the luggage checked by the customs officers. Then we were taken by bus to the railroad station where a special train waited us. Now, the passengers on that ship were quite a few Mennonites. There were other nationalities too, but so this train was meant to take all the Mennonites from Quebec City to either Winnipeg or Saskatchewan or Calgary, Alberta. We carried our hand luggage into the train. Our heavy luggage was in the baggage car to be received at Calgary, Alberta, our place of destination. Our initial impression of train travel in Canada was very negative. Dad stated, in Europe, the locomotive driver would not have been permitted to drive a cattle train. Several times we were almost thrown down from the benches on which we were sitting. I don't imagine the train had benches. Very likely they were seats. At the station in Calgary on August 1st, 1948, we were met by the 3 sponsoring families, and after getting our luggage, we were taken in several cars to my Uncle Richard's farm near Acme, Alberta, where a lavish, prepared supper awaited us. Then, on August 2nd, we were taken to the farm of Ray Davis, where Dad was to be employed for $100 a month. I was 12 years old then and started school in Canada and I should have been in grade 7, but due to the lack of any English, I was placed into grades 3, 4, and 5 in the first year and grades 6 and 7 in the second year. So I was always in my schooling in Canada a year behind. During the first few months, the students and teachers taught us vocabulary by pointing out objects and giving us their names. By Christmas, we were talking quite a lot of English, which some of our relatives found amazing. The other thing I remember seeing the Northern Lights for the first time. The spectacular moving display really shocked me into thinking, was this the end of the world? Can you imagine, 12-year-old? I then secretly prayed to God to forgive me. Later, I realized it was a fabulous display of natural events in God's creation. After about 2.5 years in Alberta, Dad had saved enough to pay off the $1,200 debt we had incurred. Dad realized that without some capital, farming in Alberta was impossible, and heard from relatives that opportunities for families in BC were significantly better. Dad had just enough money to pay for our train tickets, and we moved on February 28, 1951. Here I got my high school and engineering education, met and married my dear Elfrida 63 years ago. Glory to God in the highest. Throughout my life, I have relied on the verses in Proverbs 3, 5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Amen. Now, if you have any questions, we have about 3 minutes before the choir.
As an 11-year-old, about the St. Lawrence River, how did you take it in? I mean, did you spend most of the time on the deck?
Oh, yeah. Watched, very interesting. And the train trip from Quebec to Manitoba was very boring. Of course, it's all very north of Lake Superior, and a lot of just hills and scrubland, very few farms up there. But then after we got into Manitoba, of course, the farms, big farms started appearing, and grain elevators and all that was all new to us, because in Europe, of course, everything is very compact and you get from one place to another very quickly, whereas here we were 2 days on the train from Quebec City to, and we were in Winnipeg for about 8 hours, changing from CN, Canadian National Railroad, to CP, which went to Calgary. Canadian National went to Edmonton. They separated tracks, and so to get to Calgary, we had to go to the CP railroad. Anybody else?
Your parents finally settled down in one spot then?
Yes. Well, my dad eventually became a teacher again in a private school, teaching German and Mennonite religion and some history. And then he took classes in Vancouver while Frida was secretary to get his English, high school English, and took courses on editing. So he became the editor of a German newspaper in Winnipeg for about 20 years, something like that.
Your parents are remarkable people.
Yeah,
They were.
they really,
To keep you all together through all those
yeah,
times
right.
is an amazing feat.
Yeah, that's why I included so much of my father's stuff. It really helped me to understand my background. And I've written up a memoir. That's why I'm calling that my memoir talk, because I've taken quite a bit of it out of the memoir that I've written. I'm still not quite finished with it, and I've got way too much about our travels on cruises and all that. I need
You
to.
wouldn't want to travel after everything you went through. But
Right. Anybody else? Kathy? Yeah, he, of course, being a teacher, he knew some of those languages. His Polish was excellent, of course, but Russian is a Slavonic language like Polish, but it has a different script. But to talk to people in Russian with the Polish knowledge it's difficult to in some sense, but he had some teaching in Russian and Slovak.
When did you get to Marietta?
We got here in 94.
you were transferred here.
I was transferred from, first of all, I started working as a metallurgical engineer in Welland, Ontario, where the Union Carbide had a very old plant with very old furnaces, small furnaces that spewed a lot of dust into the air. And then they decided to build a new furnace near Montreal with complete dust collection, and we went to Japan to pick up designs of a brand new furnace, over $1 million furnace, to build near Montreal. There was a power station in the town of Beauharnois. That's where we built that furnace, because that furnace needed a lot of power. 50 megawatts was needed by that plant. Then I was transferred from there to from Welland to Montreal, and then to Niagara Falls, New York, to Pittsburgh, and then finally to Marietta. And of course, Dick Crago helped us in finding this place and finding this church, and it was amazing. I had known Dick pretty well all my working life in Welland and Montreal. He frequently came to help us with some technology.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you.
You're welcome.